Hey, welcome back. You made it for another episode of this causal analysis work. So let's continue on from where we left off last time. Last time we looked at and we talked about elements. And an element is a container that we use. It's like a little bucket, all right? And that bucket holds what we call a function, which is what we're going to get into today. And a function is where you have one tool or an object that modifies another object. And so it captures the relationship. And this is really important for us because a lot of times what we'll find is when we look at a causal structure of a problem, it's not the whole landscape that's a problem. There are specific functions within the landscape that are harmful or inefficient or excessive or absent. And so what we want to start to do is understand that function. And then once we get the function, we can look at the individual objects and we can start to dial those objects in terms of their performance, dial them up or down. Okay, so this is what we're going to look at today. We're going to start to get into this idea of functions. And this is where it's starting. I talked before about this slope. We sort of start out here and then we kind of ramp up pretty quickly. Well, we're starting to ramp up now. Well, let's look at what this looks like anyway. All right, so this is all, flip to my other screen here. So this, if you've seen the other videos, this should start to be more familiar to you now. But let's actually start to get inside some of these elements and understand what's actually happening with this function. So there's 4 examples here. And just for the moment, forget the relationship. We'll come back to the relationships in a second. But the one point to point out, or the one important idea to get here, is that we're reading from the bottom to the top. So if you're coming into this for the first time and you're reading it as equipment contains hallway, and that doesn't make sense, you're right. It doesn't make sense. And the reason is because we're starting from the bottom. Okay, that's the furthest back in time that we can go, okay, as we build our causal landscape diagram. So in this case, the hallway contains equipment. All right, so you have an object, in our case it's a tool, and there's a modification here. All right, I'm going to talk about what these modifications can look like. But the hallway contains equipment. Delivery exceeds promise. Mask blocks view, and nurse interprets vitals. So let's start with this one down here on the bottom for a second. What does that mean? The nurse interprets vitals. So the nurse is doing something. Okay, she in this case, she's making an interpretation of the vitals. It could be the patient vitals, it could be the vitals on a chart, but the nurse is actually doing something to those vitals. In this case, she's reading them, she's interpreting them. Okay, let's take another example. Let's do something like this. All right, so let's say that you've got, like I'm drinking my first cup of coffee this morning. Amazing. Right in the mustache, right where I want it to be. That's a good contradiction to explore, actually. How to have a mustache and be able to drink coffee without getting any coffee in your mustache. So when I take a sip, I don't want a mustache. And when I'm not taking a sip, I want a mustache. Anyway, contradictions for a later session. So let's take this example. When I pick up this coffee to take a drink, let's talk about what's happening here with this function. My hand is one object, and there's a cup here. All right. Now, my question to you is, what's the modification? What's actually happening here? All right, so I'm picking up the cup, I'm holding the cup. What's actually happening here? Well, in this case, my hand is holding the cup. It's supporting the cup. You could even say that there's a situation where, well, sometimes my hand is simply, move this guy over. Sometimes my hand is holding the cup and maybe my hand is lifting the cup, right? But in order for me to lift the cup, I have to first be able to hold it, right? Unless the cup is, say, setting on a tray and I'm lifting the tray. But if I wanted to lift the cup to my hand, if I wanted to lift the cup to my mouth, the first thing I have to do is hold the cup. All right? So that's our first function. Hand holds cup, hand supports cup. It's kind of up to you how you word it. Sometimes the wording is important. Sometimes it's just simply a matter of making sense to you. So in this case, let's say my hand supports the cup. And then let's say my hand, I'll put lifts the cup. Now, what's actually happening here is this is the first foundation. Before I can sort of get the cup to my mouth to take a sip, I've got to do these first actions, right? And then the next thing you might say is, if I'm going to continue to go down this path, maybe hand tilts cup, right? So in order for me to take a drink, I can't drink like this, right? I've actually got to tip the cup up like so to take a drink. So what's actually happening here is the hand in all of these examples is modifying or making a change to the cup. So in one case it's supporting it, in one case it's lifting it, and in the other case it's actually tilting it. Okay? So whenever we get into this situation where we're trying to identify the function, okay, where an object modifies another object within this element, this is what we're doing. We have to think on a very basic level. All right? Now let's move these guys out of the way for a sec. Let's put this back. Let's take another example. I'm taking physical examples because before you get into conceptual objects, it's a little bit easier to work with a physical example. So let's take another example. Let's say that I'm going to cook some breakfast, which I'm going to do in a little bit, right? I'm going to go in and make some breakfast. Now, let's say I'm going to cook an egg, okay? When I'm cooking that egg, what is the function? Now, let's just take the first example where I'm going to be cracking the egg open. I'm going to be putting the egg into a pan, and I'm going to be cooking the egg. So let's look at that first example of where I'm cooking the egg. Let's see if we can think about the function here. All right. So if we think about the pan and we think about the egg, when I cook the egg, what's actually happening? And let me start to lead you a little bit here. And let's say I'm using a gas burner, okay? So is the flame is the flame modifying the egg? So I'm cooking the egg, right? And this is kind of shorthand. But is the flame directly coming into contact with the egg? And you're probably saying, no, the flame isn't doing anything to the egg. I mean, I can't literally put the egg onto the burner itself. I can't do that. So instead I'm putting an egg into a pan, right? So let's park this for a second. So what's actually happening then? We have a situation where the pan does what with the egg? Okay, well, remember, I'm cracking the egg, I'm putting in the pan. So what's happening with the pan? Well, in this case, the pan, what do you think? Does it support? Does it lift? Does it contain? I like contain. So in this case, what's happening is the pan, we're using the pan as an object to contain the egg. Right? So the pan contains the egg. But now, let's get back to the point about I'm trying to cook this egg. Is the pan cooking the egg? Well, think about what we're playing with. We're playing with the pan, we're playing with the egg, and we're playing with a flame. There's three things we're playing with. We know that the flame isn't interacting directly with the egg. Okay, well, let's come back to this one now. We know that this isn't right. The flame is not doing anything to the egg, but is the egg interacting with the pan? So the pan contains the egg. Yeah, we've got that. So what's happening with the flame? Well, this is where we're getting our first real modification, right? The flame is doing something to the pan in order for the pan to do something to the egg. So let's look at this example. What do we think is happening? I turn on the heat, I set the pan there, and there's a reaction, right? The flame is beginning to heat the pan, right? And as it reaches a certain temperature, then what will happen is the pan will begin to modify the egg, right? So let's take that one now. All right, so in this case now, the pan can cook the egg. So if the pan contains an egg, and if the flame heats the pan, and it has to heat it specifically to a sufficient level, then actually the pan can cook the egg. So what's going to happen is, I'll bring these over here. Cha-ching. You're going to get something that looks like this. So if the pan contains an egg and the flame is able to heat the pan, then the pan can cook the egg. All right, so do you see what's happening here? We're taking one object and we're actually asking the question, in what way are you modifying something else, Mr. or Mrs. Object? What are you doing? And this is a really important one, because when we think about causal analysis, if I ask the problem, what's happening in the kitchen? You say, well, I cooked an egg. You cooked an egg. And how did you cook the egg? Well, I turned on the flame and I cooked the egg. But we typically build all of these shortcuts in to our understanding of what's happening, right? What's actually causing this problem. But in reality, there's quite a number of small interactions, quite a number of small functions that sit in there. And this is particularly important because let's look at this example for a second. We think often, not everybody, but a lot of us, and this is how I was trained, we think often in terms of if I think about an object, I think about that object being sort of an on-off switch. I either have a pan or I don't. I either have a flame or I don't. I either have an egg or I don't. But when we get into the causal landscape diagram and the type of causal analysis that we do, we stop thinking in terms of a light switch, right, on or off, and we start thinking about a dimmer, right, a dial that we can dial up or down. Let me give you an example of what I mean. That pan, right, if I'm applying heat to that pan can be made of different materials, right? Some materials heat up much faster than other materials, right? Think about your cast iron pan. Now, what about the size of the pan? Okay, the pan can be very small. Like if you're cooking an egg, maybe you want a small pan. Or maybe you're making waffles and you've got a flat iron. Is it a flat iron? I don't know. It's a flat pan or a square. They're all flat, Mike. Or you've got a square pan, right? Or you even have quite a big round pan. So do you see how we can turn the pan from just a specific object with an on-off switch, like a binary outcome, to actually sitting on a spectrum or sitting within a dial? What about the flame? Perfect example, right? The flame can be high, right? It can be on high. It can be medium. It can be low. If you have an electric stove, right, or an induction stove, well, induction stove is a little bit different, but if you have an electric stove, right, you can set the heat temperature right to where you want it. Okay, so remember, again, we're not just on or off. It's setting a dial. And what will happen later is we'll look at if that egg burned, and I asked you what was the cause of the egg burning. It's going to start to incorporate things like, what is the size of your pan? How long was the egg sitting on the pan? What was the temperature of the pan? What was the temperature of the flame underneath the pan? How high was it, etc., right? And then, of course, pan cooks egg. And again, this is not this point about cooking, right? We can define how well the egg is cooked. Okay, is it over easy? Is it over medium? Is it over hard? I mean, if you're ever having breakfast with me, I can tell you it's only going to ever be one way. It's probably going to be scrambled, right? But the point is, again, it's not one setting, is it? All right. So that's a physical object. Now, what about when we look at an object that is transactional,